Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and also Info Voices. We do regular webinars now, weekly, and we do them on various subjects that we hope will interest people, subjects that confront some of the big issues that we face in the UK and globally today. And one of the ones that we're going to be, I think, facing clearly is the position of Britain in Europe and how we confront that issue, how Europe's going to change, how Britain's going to change. And we're going to talk about how we rethink Europe, because whether we are in the European Union or out, clearly Europe is going to have to change. So we want to think of Europe not just in terms of the Brexit debate, but beyond that debate as well. And we have Ken Sweeney with us today, who runs a number of organisations relating to Europe. He comes from Ireland, and we thought that it would be great to have a sort of Irish perspective on this as well, not just a UK perspective. So welcome to this, Ken. And can I start asking you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Hi, Francis. Thanks for inviting us to the webinar. It's really great pleasure. I am the chief editor of European United, which is a non-profit media organisation. We're based in Ireland, but we do have a transnational team, and their goal is to help encourage conversation and opinion on Europe of today through publications that we do on our website and work as well as providing a platform that is to support aspiring writers. We are a citizens journalism network, so we don't have professional journalists or writers. All of our writers are just normal everyday people who are interested in European affairs and want to write about them.
You're obviously a committed European, and you do a lot of work with other European countries, and you do a lot of work in Ireland. So, you know, looking at it from that perspective, when the Brexit result happened, did it come as a shock to you?
I think so, yeah. I was more surprised about how it happened rather than why it happened. There was a certain complacency, not just in the UK, but it was everywhere, really. There was a slight bit of arrogance where people felt that it wasn't going to happen, so they weren't taking it too seriously. But as the night progressed, I remember there was a key moment that evening when our good friend Nigel Farage came on the television, and it seemed to me that he got the impression that they were never going to win this referendum. So he came on quite early and almost admitted defeat. And that seemed to be the turning point. It seemed to just go downhill, well, or uphill, depending on your perspective, from there. And as it got to midnight, we all began to realise that this was not going to go the way that most pro-Europeans had envisaged. So yes, it was a surprise. I mean, I think it was a surprise in the sense that it seemed to be a change in how politics was happening. For me, it was the first time that social media really played a part in politics and how it influenced an election. And we saw the continuation of that through Trump. So, yep, it was a big surprise. I mean, obviously, it was a big surprise here in Ireland as well, because we knew even before the referendum was taking place, we knew what the ramifications would be for us. We were trying to make people aware that the border issue was probably going to be the biggest factor. Generally, we were ignored, I think, not just by the British media, but we were ignored by the European media as well. And I suppose those chickens have come home to roost now.
So, you know, you've seen the debate that's happened in the UK, and you can see that it's quite an acrimonious debate, and no one here knows what's going to happen. Whether it's going to be a deal or no Brexit in the end. I mean, looking at it from an Irish perspective, how do you see things sort of turning out?
Well, if you'd asked me that question probably back in November, I would have said definitely that there would be a deal. I think that the general mood over here is that we need to start preparing for a no deal. But if you were to ask me to go out on a limb and make some sort of prediction, I think they'll probably extend Article 50. I think that's what they're probably going to try and do. No one wants a no deal. So I think that would be the best, in my opinion, at the moment. That's probably the best thing they can do. If they can get an extension of the deadline from March, maybe to the end of November for 2019, that could probably be the best thing, because not only would it give the opportunity for countries like ourselves to probably prepare for it a bit more, because to be honest, we were complacent as well here in Ireland, and it was the same in the other countries. They really thought that there was going to be a deal. So I think nobody has. I don't think anyone's prepared for a no deal. So I think it was just. I think the best thing to do is that they probably try and extend Article 50.
But do you think that if they try to extend Article 50, that will, create a lot of problems and a lot of tension and a lot of disquiet here in the UK?
I think they already have that, though. Surely it can escalate for sure, but whatever happens come March, I think that the problems are escalating to that point where you can't do nothing. And I think a no deal would be worse. And even hardened Brexiteers are beginning to admit it now. You hear the likes of Mogg and others talking about it, saying that they don't want a hard Brexit. They might say that they think they can handle a hard Brexit, but they don't really want it. So a no deal is going to be a negative for everyone. I think they'll find some way of extending it and putting it across in a way that they'll keep their supporters happy. If they can maybe come up with a new deadline, that might make a difference. But if they postpone it indefinitely, for sure, it would be the worst thing. So if they're going to postpone it, they will have to come up with a new deadline.
But what about the option of a second referendum? I mean, in Ireland, about the second referendum.
Yeah.
Vote. Yeah. But the other side, Brexit, is saying, but you've had the vote, and if you have another vote, you get into never-ending referendums. I mean, is the second referendum, do you think something, again, from an Irish point of view, is desirable, or do you think it's something that couldn't happen?
I think the politics in Ireland and the politics in the UK are very different. We are a nation that has no problem looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, did we do something wrong, and maybe we can correct it. I don't know whether that's possible in the UK. I just think the whole thing has gone so divisive now. Also, one has to look at what we were saying no to in those referendums about Europe. A lot of that had to do with our stance on neutrality, and through ignorance on our own part, we kind of didn't really look at the treaty too deeply. And when that news came out that our neutrality was not really being considered, we went at it from a constitutional point of view and said, well, look, we are happy to accept Lisbon, and we're happy to accept all of the treaties as long as our neutrality is recognised. And the compromise was made, and we voted again. So I think we almost made we made a very informed vote in the second time round on both of those occasions. Whereas I think now you have this huge divide in the UK, and it's just so evident from where we're sitting. You can see it. I mean, on Facebook and on Twitter and so on, you might see people saying, oh, there's a sway this way or a sway that way. But I don't think it's that big of a sway. I think it's still very close. And the longer you leave it without some kind of decision, throwing another referendum in could be the worst thing. But I mean, maybe there should be a referendum to ask, would you support a second referendum on leaving the European Union? So maybe there could be a pre-referendum on a proper referendum or something like that, that could give people in Britain an honest, clear idea of just how popular is the idea to remain now against how popular it is to stay. But I don't know. It's just, it's very divisive,
Yeah, it is. And that does sound like never-ending referendum territory.
It does, it does. But yeah.
What about Ireland itself? I mean, the backstop has been a big issue. The fear that in Northern Ireland that they'll be having a different arrangement with Europe and the rest of the UK, which the DUP clearly doesn't want, and that's a real problem because they've got a sway in the House of Commons. I mean, is a backstop an issue that you feel strongly about in Ireland?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a cornerstone of our existence at this point, because you need to live in Ireland to understand just how closely aligned we are with Northern Ireland as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm old enough to remember days when I would go up to Northern Ireland and it would be literally like going from East Berlin to West Berlin. And those days, almost immediately after the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, those days almost disappeared overnight. Over a short period of weeks, the border controls went down, the checkpoints went down, the watchtowers went down, because people really wanted it, North and South. They really wanted it. Whatever because the Good Friday Agreement, in hindsight, it looked like it was a massive success, but it didn't. It went on for ages. There was disputes over disposal of arms. There was disputes over who would get amnesty from the terrorist organizations, who would be released from prison. There was disputes, of course, then eventually over actually power sharing. In the meantime, there was a shift in unionist politics. The DUP would have been the outsiders. They moved in. It didn't go, like, it wasn't all just completely overnight, but what did happen overnight was that the border went away and that people were able to immediately work together. And this sometimes happens with countries when they've been forcibly divided. So I think even the unionist community recognized that the border had to go away. So for us, the Good Friday Agreement is paramount to our existence, and within that, this issue about the backstop. It must be there because it has to protect what we have worked for, and we've worked for like 100 years for that, and probably even a lot longer. So for us, Brexit is like, it's an internal dispute in the UK that seems to be inflicting pain on us, and we're being quite patient about it, I think. But at the same time, we have to draw a line somewhere. We're definitely not anti-British, because I think of any country in Europe, I think Ireland understands Britain more than any other country, because we get your TV, we get your magazines, we get your newspapers, we get your media. You and I are talking now, and we share your language. So we have so much in common with the UK that it can't be a simple case of we don't agree with what they agree with. We understand the situation, but we also have to say that we are an independent state, and our situation must be as important to us.
Yeah, I mean, you say it causes pain in Ireland, but it's causing pain in the rest of Europe as well.
Sure, yeah.
I mean,
the
fallout of Brexit is making people in Europe consider whether Europe is going to survive as an identity politically, or whether it will fragment into nation states.
Yes, yeah. Well, look, I mean, I'm kind of on the fence a little bit over that, and I'm kind of told I have to be with what we do. I mean, there is propaganda on both sides. I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm very pro-Europe, not necessarily always pro-EU. And the issue with the EU has probably been, this has probably been festering for quite a while, this populist growth. Some countries have come about with this prior to the 2007 recession. So it's been brewing for quite a while, and I think the problem is that it's been more or less unchecked. And with the rise of Brexit initially, and then you have Trump, I think those who would have been considered on the fringes, the likes of Le Pen and so on, they're now becoming out in the spotlight because they're using social media and they're using forms of communication a lot better maybe than even the European Union has been for quite a while. So overall, I think it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. But at the same time, these populist groups, if they do get into power, they are going to have to run a country, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. I remember back in the early 2000s when Austria had a so-called far-right government. It's not as easy as they think it is, and sometimes their hardline issues are often put to the side when they realize that they have to pay for things and have to raise revenue and taxes and so on, and they need people's votes. So a lot of these far-right groups, they tend to have very little understanding of what it takes to actually run a country. And I tend to say, let them get in there and get exposed quick enough, and they'll see how difficult it is, and they'll shy away. But there is definitely a threat in it. But this is what happens, I grew up in an era of Europe completely divided down the middle, where there was a threat of communism all the time, and that didn't stay with us. So as long as we keep democracy, and we don't succumb to their propaganda, I think we can ride it out. It comes in fits and bursts.
There's a note of optimism in the way you say it, and that's great. But I know a major British general has worried that the growth of national populism and nationalism in Europe, and fragmentation into nation states, is taking us into the territory that we were in just before the First World War, and we're similar to that situation. And then, because we had inadequate politicians, we had nations competing against each other because they wanted to get their share of empire and their share of wealth, it led almost by accident to a horrific war. And he says we're moving into that situation as well if we are not careful. Does that worry you?
Right. It does, but I think the motives of people, say, aligning themselves with far right groups is different. I think what's happening with them is that they have, more issues more at home. They're more concerned about getting a job, having more social welfare, and the populists being populists are going to promise those things. They're going to say, you vote for us, we'll give you an extra 20 euros in your pension every month. So I don't think these people, these millennials who are following these far right groups, are prepared to put on a uniform and go and fight for a fascist leader. So I do get what they're saying, but I think the threats are not as militaristic. I think they're more social rather than militaristic. I don't think anyone's going to go to war in Europe right now against each other. We're just so closely aligned. And the funny thing is, a lot of these populist groups, putting aside the far right extreme groups like Golden Dawn and so on, but they're not all of them are like that. These populist groups, a lot of them are pro-European and pro-EU even to a certain degree. They want what the EU have. They just want to, in many respects, just get a little bit more their way. And how we go about that is a job for bureaucrats and politicians. It's not for me really to say how you do it. But I suppose we could start by looking at where we're going wrong with our citizens and maybe communicating more with them. That's an issue that I have always had with the European Union. I think the European Union has always been very bad at communicating itself. Its focus on certain demographics as well sometimes can be an issue. There's a lot of focus over the last 10 years on youth, which is fantastic, but I think you also need to focus on the middle income earners, because it's those people who are paying the highest amount of tax and so on in many countries. They feel left out, and it's also those people who are going to these populist leaders and populist politicians and saying, well, what can you do for me on a local level? And that's where they've clicked. They've clicked by saying, yep, I'm going to promise you, better income. I'm going to get you a job that's better. Your daughter's going to go into school for free, and they don't care if they're going to deliver them. They're just going to say that until they get there, and then they'll no doubt find some way of putting that aside. So I know what you're saying about being optimism, but at the same time, we need to maybe adopt, a bit more communication techniques, and our politicians, especially in the centre, need to be more proactive in that. They need to get back on the streets.
Well, yeah, get back on the streets. I mean, it's not communication, is it? It's actually realising that the growth of populism, national populism, which is now threatening the European project, is a result of lots of people being felt or feeling that they've been left out, they haven't been listened to, and that politicians have become an elite that, talk to themselves and not to people. So that is communication. But how do we bridge that gap? How do we get politicians not just to communicate, but to understand that there are people out there who want to have a part of the story, and they're not getting it at the moment?
Well, maybe social media has probably been too much used by political parties recently. Politicians love to tweet, and I think they're not targeting all the demographics that they need to target. Certainly, there's a lot of young people, and there's a lot of middle class people who are on, say, for example, Twitter. But the voting capacity that they want to get at is not always there. So maybe they're at a very local level. So many of my own politicians here are closing down their local clinics. They're saying that there's no need for them anymore. Well, obviously there may be a need for these type of things where they need to be not so much online and maybe on the doors. In Ireland, it's something that we don't do over here, and luckily we don't suffer from that. But I don't know what it's like abroad, but our politicians don't knock on enough doors. And if they're going to get in touch with every part of the public, they need to knock on doors. They need to get on the streets, because that's what, say, for example, I mean, a populist party for us traditionally in Ireland would have been Sinn Féin, even though they would have been on the left. But they're always on the doors. They've got more local councillors and senators than they have the TDs, as we call them, or MPs here. So their policy has always been to be on the streets. They've been on the streets since day one. Whereas you look at the two major parties here in Ireland, the two centre parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Fine Gael will be your right, and Fianna Fáil will be your left. Traditionally, they've always relied on the people to come to them. And then with the recession in 2008, there was just the case of, because Fianna Fáil were so seen as responsible for the recession here in Ireland, they lost a lot of their support, and Fine Gael stepped into that void. But neither of those parties have changed really what they've done over the last 20 years. They're still waiting for people to come to them. And even when I personally try to speak to politicians, whether it be to interview them for European Union or even to actually find out what they're up to, it's very hard to get in touch with them. You send them an email or you won't hear from them. You try and ring them, they won't answer the phone. So I don't know what it's like in the rest of Europe, but it seems to me that those big parties, those big behemoth parties, they've lost touch. Maybe it's something that they need to look at from a youth point of view. They need to get more younger people who are part of their parties to do more work on the streets.
Well, that's one of the obvious things that's happening in Europe. The main big parties are disintegrating, and lots of smaller parties are beginning to fill the vacuum. So I mean, you're saying that that the parties have got to communicate better in the sense of talking to people on the street, finding out what they need, listening, and also putting what they hear into action and not ignoring it. But what other reforms do you think we need to do in Europe? Because whatever happens, whether Brexit happens or whether Brexit doesn't happen, there's still going to be a problem in the European project and in Europe generally. Now, Ania, how do we, rethink Europe so it becomes meaningful again for all of us?
I think Europe needs to be more socially democratic for a start. Maybe looking at a confederalism system where the nations themselves that are part of the European Union can be broken down into almost like cantons, where people can have more contact with their local politicians. But the big issues that are plaguing people, healthcare, for example, could be solved at a much larger level. For example, our healthcare in Ireland is a disaster. It's a complete disaster. I could spend 2 hours going into detail why it's a disaster, but suffice to say, you don't want to get sick in Ireland. And it's not like the United States where you would probably go broke, but in Ireland, you'd just be waiting for something to happen, for you to be cured or to have your operation or everything. So obviously our country is in dire need of a new healthcare system. And over here, they've been talking about the Dutch system for the last 20 years, about how they want to adopt that, where it's a combination of private and public healthcare, but nothing's been initiated. And then it's the same with the NHS in the UK. They're pouring money into it, and it doesn't seem to be the answer. Money just doesn't seem to be the answer. So maybe there needs to be a set of 5 or 6 principles that Europe needs to look at on a large scale, whether that be healthcare, defence, job creation, and so on, and just basically get them out to the people, find out what those people want from that, and working on a plan that suits everyone and that is flexible enough, but at the same time uniform enough. Now, I have seen these initiatives being done. There is a Europe-wide initiative called Communicating Europe, which is where there are local town hall meetings of people from all walks of life at a very local level discussing what they want from Europe. And I've attended these here in Ireland, and the premise is exactly the same, whether it's here in Ireland or whether it's in Romania, for example. And I think the feedback that I noticed from our meetings and from I've seen abroad is, again, that people just want to be healthy, they want to be happy, and they want to feel secure. Does that involve a European army? I personally don't think it does. I think that maybe bringing together a police force, for example, is a better idea than actually creating a European army, because it seems to be very trendy at the moment that Europe is calling for a European army, and you have Macron and Chancellor Merkel talking about it as well. But do the people really want that? I don't know. I think people just want to be safe, but they feel safer with a good police force rather than soldiers on the street.
I mean, we've had some comments coming up. Boris on Facebook, it's not Boris Johnson, by the way, so don't worry. But Boris on Facebook is saying that, what's happening is that capitalism as we've known it is sort of failing, and no one yet knows quite what to do. And Karina on our webinar platform says, you know, if we're going to rethink Europe, do we not have to rethink the neoliberal model, which is the one that's created these business elites, and that's created a situation of total disengagement between those who make the decisions and those who have to suffer the decisions.
Yeah, I would agree on both of those points. I think that but what happens is, though, the problem with Europe, and I find it, is that there are nations within the EU membership that are probably at different levels of democracy. You have Ireland, say, who's had the democracy problems maybe back in the 1970s and 80s, and they're very similar to what maybe Hungary is experiencing now. So the problem is, how do you integrate all of those things? Because countries like Poland and Hungary, they still require big investment from big companies. You know, they're in recovery situation from 60 years of communism. So their industries are not there. They're still finding their way. But I do agree that it's something that certainly could be, both of those points could be initiated, but you must be careful about how you do that. What we don't want at the end of the day is fragmentation in the European Union. We don't want to have another exit. I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think how it would happen is that if we force more integration on the people of Europe, I don't think people want more integration right now. I don't think they want the call for a federalist Europe. I think what they want is to be, as you say, to have more security about their own daily lives. They want more work opportunities. They want more training opportunities. They want to pay less, maybe pay less tax, and they want to be healthy. But I don't think they really want those ideas that seem to be a little bit in a kind of a bubble type ideas where people are talking about, you know, a European federal union. Believe me, I'm in favor of it. I just don't think right now it is the right thing to do. I think what we need to do is consolidate what we have, go back to the people, talk to them, introduce more social democratic models, and try and get people's feedback on that, and also try to react quicker when they give us their opinions.
I mean, it's quite interesting when I ask you what changes need to be made. You talked about decentralization at a local level, and I think a lot of people will agree that, you know, saving our democracies at even the highest level means saving it first at our local level, and that becomes important. But you also talked about having a different Europe, a more confederal Europe, that we don't need more integration. And is that what you mean by a confederal Europe, or what President Macron in France means when he talks about a Europe of concentric circles, that people can come in and take what they want and not necessarily take what they don't want? There has to be more choice. We've got to create a system of flexibility which allows local and national aspirations to be met within a wider framework.
See, I think the problem with nationalism is that it's a bit like confederacy. You know, if you mention the word the Confederate States, people automatically think of the United States, think of slavery, think of all of the bad connotations that came out of the American Civil War. And it's the same almost with nationalism now. It seems that word seems to have been hijacked by both liberals and the right. The thing about nationalism, it's not all bad. It's just that it's being used in a bad way. And also, see, what irritates me slightly is that as a European, I don't like the idea of this replacing regional nationalism with a supranationalism, because, you know, we see it. We see people online. They talk about how the rise of nationalism is bad for Europe, but they're flying a European flag. They're talking about a European anthem. They're talking about this, that, and making themselves Europeans. So are we not just replacing nationalism with a larger form of nationalism? So I don't think that we should be so afraid to embrace nationalism. It's fine. It's the parts of it that we have, the cultures, the languages, all of those things must be preserved, and they're all part of nationalism. So we need to get away from this idea of bashing nationalism. We need to look at the causes of what is making this anti-European feeling, and this feeling that we need to be separate and we need to look after our own affairs. Maybe we do need to do that. This is the issue. Maybe we are moving slightly fast. So the euro, has it been that big of a success? Well, it certainly survived. I wouldn't put it down as a massive success. So maybe we need to say, well, do we have to force all of the rest of the member states to take on the euro? So I think there should be a slow down process. And as to say, if we are going to integrate, we need to look at very closely at what are we going to integrate. Police, healthcare, yes, top priority. But other things like, say, deciding about what local party is going to run where, I think those are issues that people don't want. And probably the political establishment don't want that either. Because you may see there's a party that might be the biggest party in Malta or the biggest party in Denmark. If you have a large federal setup, what happens to those parties? Are they going to amalgamate with parties that are similar to them? But they're not going to like that. So we need to take things, I think, a lot slower and let people just kind of ease into the idea of further integration. Because it seems to me that the further integration that has happened so far has been at a level where they haven't really asked people whether they want it or not. They just assumed that this was good for them, and it turns out that all the time it doesn't seem to have been. And while Brexit was an extreme, there were certain truths within Brexit that should have been addressed at an earlier point. And maybe if those truths had been addressed earlier on, Brexit might not have happened.
I mean, if you have the sort of Europe you want, which could even be a greater Europe and involve, more and more countries in Europe, if you do that, you actually then develop a European identity, but you wouldn't be able to have this rigid, bureaucratic freedom of movement idea that the European Union has, would you? You can come to all sorts of other arrangements.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, though, that the federalists, that they really know what they want. They seem to have a structure, but they don't seem to be able to fill that structure with real issues. They don't seem to be able to solve the real issues. They don't seem to be able to put together an actual 100-page setup on how you would establish a European state. And so what happens is they cling to the names of Spinelli and all of those people, and they quote these people all the time, but they don't seem to be able to have a real plan to instigate closer federal union. But confederalism works really easy because you have it all in place already. You just need to get people together and decide what you're going to do. The euro was the start. The euro was the start.
Yeah,
I don't think money should have been the first way to do it.
Isn't the Council of Europe the sort of model that you should be following rather than the European Union?
Probably, yes. I think so. I think it's one of the more successful parts of the European Union. It's definitely worked in that way, yes.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end, but you're saying that the European Union doesn't really know where it wants to go, and it's sort of going into an impasse in a way. Brexit is a different type of impasse as well, and we've got to get out of this impasse somehow or the other. How do you suggest we go about that, and how would they sort of contact you and your group and find out what you're doing in order to try and help do that?
Well, our group, I'll straightly say, our group is we're more commentators and we're more observers rather than activists. I mean, an activist organization would be somebody like New Europeans, Roger Castell's organization, which do a really great job in highlighting the civil rights and liberties of people and making sure that they're in place. But I think Brexit and the European Union are two very separate issues now. I don't think we're going to see Britain staying in the European Union. I'm sorry to all the people out there who probably say that's not right, but I just don't see that happening right now. I think there's either going to be a customs union or a single market setup, or either there's going to be a full crash out. I'm more optimistic about the SMCU option, but I think Britain has to leave. Now, that's not to say that they won't come back, but I think the European issue is different to that. They probably need to know whether Britain's going to stay or not before they can do anything. And I think once that happens, they will probably then start to make more firmer decisions. I'm hoping, as I say, that those decisions will be based around having more regional setups, having a European clinic in some of the major towns and cities across Europe where people can go in and find out more about the European Union, and they can talk to people and find out how the European Union can help them. Maybe politicians might not be too crazy about that at the local level, but that's something that can be done. But like I say, there is no real rush to do things. There's no real rush to bring Europe closer. I think it could be the worst thing that could happen right now. So what they need to do is probably consolidate what they have. But with regards to Brexit, I think it needs to happen. It needs to end. because what's happening is it's stagnating the rest of Europe. We're kind of sitting around waiting to see what will happen. And we've got an American election coming up in a couple of years' time. So if we're going to drag Brexit on to 2020, I think that could be a problem for us. So really, those two problems that initial problem needs to be solved before the European problem can be solved. But look, we've survived worse, and if anything should have broken Europe, it should have been that recession back in 2008. It didn't. So I think we're all strong enough collectively as Europeans. I still think we're in a vast majority when it comes to the far right. I think we are coming together as Europeans. We can push away a few angry politicians. I don't think it's the end of the European Union by any measure. I think it's going to live for a long, long time. It may eventually evolve into something different, but at the end of the day, the basic principles of the European Union are solid, and they're not just liberal. They're not just liberal ideas. They're ideas from a humanist point of view, and we shouldn't be afraid or embarrassed to shout them from the hilltops. So we're going through a few dark years. They're going to be getting a bit of traction. They're going to be screaming and shouting. They're going to be talking about how they want to break up the European Union. But at the end of the day, as I said from the very start, they're going to end up running a country, and they'll find out how difficult it is once they have to run a country. And it's the same. It's the same for the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg in the UK. He can talk about how easy it's going to be after Brexit, but the realization will come very quickly on his door. And you'll see these guys shirking away, and hopefully we will see a day that if Britain decides to leave the European Union, that it will come back and it'll be a better country for it.
And very briefly, finally, tell us a bit about your organisation and how people could get in touch with you if they wanted to be involved in any way.
Yeah, well, we're always looking for writers. I mean, we love to have writers. As long as there is a concept on Europe, it can be anything. I'm always open to listening to anyone.
Just tell us who you are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got an immediate team. There's an immediate team of 4 of us. There is 2 lads based in myself and Christos, who is Greek. He's based in Ireland. There is my German counterpart, Martina Brinkman, who is the online editor. She's based in Germany. Then there's Oli Ashinska. She works in the editing and proofreading side of things. And then we also have, we've got a few new people that are coming in, which I do not want to say right now, but they will be coming in quite soon. But we also have a team of around 21 writers. Of those writers, there's probably about 7 or 8 really regular writers. We do cover a lot of aspects from Eastern Europe right across to Brexit. We would love to hear more people write about Brexit, because that's what people want to hear. So if people want to get in touch with us, the best way you can get in touch with us is our email address, which is very simple. It's info@europaunited.eu. And if they can just send us an email just telling us a little bit about themselves and why they'd like to write for us. I'm always ears, and I'll always get back to everyone who gets in touch with us.
Okay, well, thanks, Ken. That's great. So it's Europa United, and that's.
Can I just one more thing? Can I just say one more thing? Yeah. Sorry, I just want to say thank you very much. I also want to say I think Global 21 is an amazing organisation, and we've been following you guys very closely. And I think it's brilliant what you do, Francis. It's a real citizens initiative, and I always appreciate citizens initiatives. I think it's fantastic that you get people coming on. I watch your videos all the time, and people come on from a really local level. And if anything, you guys should be a great model for something that should be incorporated at an EU level. It's a really positive citizens initiative, and you should be very proud of it. So I just want to say that to you before we finish up.
Okay, well, thanks. I really appreciate that, and I hope that we do help to make a difference in a small way. So, but thank you, because I think you're doing the same, and you're getting people to talk about issues and debate issues and think beyond the immediate sort of problems that we're facing right at the moment. And that's really, really important. So thank you for joining us. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again, and we'll keep in touch with you, and we'll try and, see how this whole thing develops over the months and over the years to come. So thank you for doing this, and that's
lovely. Pleasure. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll end this.
Thank you.
We'll end this interview now. Thank you.